When Gideon and Margot Crandall showed up at the Millfield County tax auction with $340 between them, nobody expected them to bid. They were 74 and 71 years old, sitting in the back row on metal folding chairs that squeaked against the courthouse floor every time someone shifted their weight. Gideon has sat with his back straight, the way he always sat, a habit from 40 years of job sites, where slouching meant you weren't paying attention. Margot sat beside him with her hands folded in her lap, her knuckles swollen at every joint the way they had been for the past 5 years since the arthritis took her fingers from her one knuckle at a time. Nobody looked at them. Nobody had reason to. The room held about 30 people, most of them familiar faces in a small county. A man in overalls who bought empty lots for $15 each. A young couple whispering about a half-acre near the creek. And in the third row, a man named Sullivan, Selby, mid-50s, wearing a vest over a button-down shirt with the sleeves rolled to his elbows. The kind of man who dressed carefully enough to look like he hadn't tried. Sullivan was a property investor from 2 towns over. He'd already picked up 2 small houses on the auction list, both of them cheap enough to renovate and rent out at a profit. He worked with a pencil and a yellow legal pad, and every number he wrote down had a dollar sign next to it. The auctioneer was a woman in a gray blazer who read property descriptions off a clipboard without enthusiasm. She had done this before. The lots went first, then the small houses, and then she turned to the last item on the list. 14 Prosper Street. Victorian residence, approximately 4,000 square feet, 3 stories plus a tower. Condemned by the county in 1991. No water, no electric, no gas. Roof status unknown. Foundation status unknown. Starting bid is $12. A man in the middle of the room turned around and grinned at everyone behind him. "That's the haunted house," he said. People laughed. A few shook their heads. The auctioneer waited with her pen in hand, already moving to mark it unsold. Gideon raised his hand. The room went quiet, not gradually, all at once, like someone had closed a door on every conversation in the building. $12, Gideon said, for the house. The auctioneer looked at him over the top of her glasses. "Sir, you understand this property is condemned. The county makes no guarantees about structural integrity, habitability, or safety." "I understand. There are no utilities connected. You would need to petition the county for reconnection, and that requires a structural certification from a licensed engineer." "I'm a licensed structural engineer," Gideon said. "Retired." The auctioneer blinked. She looked at her clipboard, then back at him. $12 to the gentleman in the back. Nobody challenged the bid. In the third row, Sullivan Selby stopped writing on his legal pad and turned around. He didn't smile the way the other man had. He studied Gideon with the focused expression of someone recalculating a number he'd already decided was final. After the auction, Sullivan caught Gideon in the hallway outside the courtroom. He was leaning against the wall with his legal pad tucked under one arm. "You're the structural engineer," retired Gideon said. "That house needs at least $80,000 in repairs. You have $80,000. I have 328. Sullivan looked at him for a long moment. "I passed on that property because the math doesn't work. What do you see that I don't?" "Bones," Gideon said. He didn't explain what he meant. He took Margot's arm and they walked out of the courthouse into the morning light, and Sullivan Selby stood in the hallway watching them go, with his pencil tapping against the legal pad in a rhythm that had no music in it. 2 weeks before the auction, Gideon had been standing in the kitchen of the house he'd lived in for 42 years. His eldest son, Mercer, was taping a for sale sign to the front window. Mercer was 48, a real estate attorney who wore suits that cost more than Gideon's first car and carried a phone that never left his hand. He didn't look up when he spoke. "It's already done, Dad. The buyer closes Friday." Gideon was holding a coffee mug that said, "World's Best Grandpa." His 3 grandchildren had given it to him when the youngest was 4. That girl was in college now and hadn't called since Christmas. "Your mother's piano is in the living room," Gideon said. "The movers will deal with it. She's had that piano for 31 years, Mercer. And the buyer doesn't want it." Mercer finally looked up from his phone. "Dad, we talked about this. The equity in this house is the only retirement plan you two have. Split 3 ways, it gives each of us enough to manage things." Gideon heard the words clearly. Each of us. Not you and Mom. Each of us. The money was not for Gideon and Margot. The money was for Mercer, for his sister Estelle, and for his brother Holden. 3 children dividing the life their parents had built the way you divide an estate after a funeral, except both parents were still standing in the kitchen watching it happen. Mercer left an hour later. He said his siblings would work something out about where Gideon and Margot could stay. Before he walked out the front door, he passed through the hallway and paused at the bedroom. Margot was upstairs packing. She heard the familiar sound of her jewelry box opening the small brass hinge she'd heard 10,000 times in 42 years. She assumed Mercer was looking for paperwork. She didn't get up to check. The hinge closed. Footsteps went down the stairs. The front door shut. Nobody worked anything out. Their daughter Estelle lived 40 minutes away in a house with 4 empty bedrooms. Margot called her that evening. The conversation lasted less than 3 minutes. "The timing isn't good, Mom." Margot held the phone against her ear and looked at the suitcase open on the bed, half filled with a life she was trying to fold small enough to carry. "When would the timing be good, Estelle?" Silence on the other end. Then the line went dead. Their second son, Holden, had changed his phone number the week before. He sent a single text message suggesting they look into senior communities. Mercer's assistant emailed them a list of subsidized housing with an 18-month waiting list. Gideon sat in the driveway of what used to be his home and counted the money in his wallet. $340. Margot sat beside him with her hands folded in her lap, the same way she would sit beside him 2 weeks later in the back row of a county courthouse. "Where do we go?" she asked. Gideon put his hands on the steering wheel. He didn't start the engine right away. He looked at the house through the windshield, at the for sale sign in the window at the front door that was no longer his to open. 42 years. He had spent his career inspecting structures for other people. He checked foundations, measured load-bearing walls, certified that buildings were safe for families to live in. He made sure other people's homes would stand, and now he couldn't hold his own. He picked up the coffee mug from the console between the seats. He'd carried it out of the kitchen without thinking about it. He turned it in his hands, reading the words printed on the side. "World's best grandpa." His fingers were steady the way they always were. 40 years of holding instruments and measuring tools had given him hands that didn't shake. But something in his chest was shaking, a vibration deep in the framing of him that he couldn't name and couldn't stop. He set the mug on the dashboard and turned the key. "East," he said. "Why east?" "Because west was where Mercer lived. North was Estelle. South was Holden. East was the only direction that didn't lead to someone who had already turned them away." They drove for 3 hours through flat farmland and small towns that looked the same from the highway. Margot didn't speak for the first hour. The silence between them was not empty. It was full of 42 years of conversations they didn't need to have out loud, full of the house behind them and the nothing ahead of them. Then Margot said, "Are you angry?" Gideon kept his eyes on the road. Angry at who? The children. He was quiet for a long time. Long enough that the landscape changed outside the windows from suburban sprawl to open fields to the kind of country where you could see the horizon in every direction. "I'm angry at myself," he said. "I raised 3 children and not one of them learned how to treat another person." "That's not your fault," Margot said. "Some of it is. It was the only time in 51 years of marriage that Margot disagreed with him about something that mattered, and she did it by saying nothing at all. They ended up in Millfield because they needed gas, and it had the first station they'd seen in 20 miles. It was one of those towns that had been something once. A main street with a hardware store, a diner, a post office, and a church with a tall white steeple. Half the storefronts were dark. The population sign said 2,000, but the paint was faded and peeling, and nobody had bothered to update it in years. They parked on Main Street because Margot needed a restroom, and the only place open at 3 in the afternoon was a diner called Corinne's. A woman behind the counter looked up when they came in. She was about 60 with reading glasses on a chain around her neck and a coffee pot in each hand. Regular or decaf? Just the restroom if that's all right, Gideon said. Sit down first. I'll bring you both a cup. You look like you've been driving a while. Her name was Corinne Ashworth. She'd owned the diner for 30 years, and she had the kind of face that had seen enough trouble to recognize it in other people without needing to ask about it. She brought them coffee and 2 slices of blueberry pie. When Gideon reached for his wallet, she shook her head. First-timers eat free. Is that a real policy, Gideon asked? It is now. While Margot was in the restroom, Corinne set a 3rd slice of pie on the counter in front of Gideon. She did it quietly, the way you do something you don't want to make a fuss about. You don't need to tell me what happened, she said. But anybody who drives 3 hours without knowing where they're going needs an extra piece of pie. Gideon looked at her. It was the first time in 2 weeks that someone had been kind to him without wanting something in return. No paperwork, no waiting list, no phone call that ended in silence. Just a woman with a coffee pot and a slice of pie, and the simple understanding that sometimes people show up at your counter because they have nowhere else to be. Gideon saw the auction notice taped to the bulletin board by the restroom door. Millfield County Tax Auction, Saturday, 10 a.m. County Courthouse. 13 properties. He read the list while Margot finished her pie. Most were empty lots. A few were houses in various stages of collapse. At the bottom, 14 Prosper Street, Victorian circa 1890. Condemned, no utilities, structural assessment unknown. Minimum bid $12. $12 for a house, Gideon said mostly to himself. Corinne appeared behind him with the coffee pot. That's the Prentice place. Been empty since old Jolene died. 60 years, give or take. Kids around here call it haunted. Is it? Corinne shrugged. Every old house makes noises. People hear what they want to hear. Margot looked at Gideon across the counter. Gideon looked at the flyer. They had the kind of conversation that people have after 51 years of marriage, which is to say they had it mostly without words. We don't have anywhere else to go, Margot said quietly. I know. $12, Gideon. I know. She took another bite of pie. It's probably terrible. Probably. She set her fork down. Let's go look at it. That was how they found the town. Not by plan or map. A woman with 2 coffee pots and a policy she made up on the spot and a flyer on a bulletin board, and the simple fact that east was the only direction left. They drove to the house with the windows down. Prosper Street was lined with old elms that had been planted when the houses were built more than a century ago. The homes along the road were small and well kept with gardens and fenced yards. All of them except the last one. The Victorian sat at the dead end, separated from its nearest neighbor by an empty lot overgrown with goldenrod and thistle. 3 stories of wood frame architecture, a tower on the southeast corner, and a wraparound porch that sagged badly on the left side where a support post had rotted and given way. The paint had peeled down to bare wood in long curling strips. One window in the tower was broken, and a bird had built a nest in the gap. The yard was more weed than grass. Gideon parked at the curb and got out. He stood on the sidewalk with his hands in his pockets and didn't move for a full minute. He was looking at the house the way he had looked at 10,000 structures in his career. Not at the surface, through it, past the peeling paint and the sagging porch, and the broken glass to the thing underneath the skeleton of the building, the frame and the foundation, and the way the weight traveled from the roof down through the walls to the ground. He walked up the front steps, testing each one before committing his weight. He put his hand flat against the nearest porch column and held it there, fingers spread wide against the wood. Then he looked up at the roof line and down at the foundation stones visible through the gaps where the lattice had fallen away. "The bones are good," he said. Margot was still in the car. "You can tell that from the porch." "I can tell that from the porch." The key fit the front door after some persuading. The lock was rusted, but the mechanism still turned. The door swung inward, and the smell came first. Dust, old wood, something faintly sweet that might have been dried flowers left in a room for decades. The foyer was dark until Gideon found a window and forced the shutter open. Sunlight fell across a hardwood floor buried under decades of dust. A staircase rose along the left wall, solid oak, the banister carved and still intact. Straight ahead was a parlor with a bay window. To the right, a dining room with a stone fireplace, the mantel still holding a row of small ceramic figures, too dust-covered to identify. Gideon went down to the cellar with a flashlight for 10 minutes. When he came back up, he was nearly smiling, which was something Margot had not seen him do in 2 weeks. "Oak framing throughout," he said. "Stone foundation, no visible cracks. The porch needs rebuilding, and the roof has maybe 3 soft spots near the chimney, but the core structure is sound. Whoever built this house built it to stand for 200 years. And we got it for $12, Margot said. "We got it for $12. That first night they slept in the parlor on sleeping bags from the thrift store on Main Street. No electricity, no running water. Gideon had picked up a battery lantern and a case of bottled water from the hardware store. The owner, a quiet man named Dalton Langford, had looked at the $12 deed and shaken his head slowly. But he opened a store credit line without being asked. "Pay when you can," Dalton said. "Come back when you need something. You will." After dark, the house made noises. Creaks and pops, the low groan of old wood adjusting to the cool night air. The exterior walls cooled faster than the interior structure, and the differential stress traveled through the framing in sounds that moved like whispers through the rooms. Gideon lay on a sleeping bag and listened. "It's not ghosts," he said. "I know it's not ghosts, Gideon. I've been married to you for 51 years. I know how houses breathe." He almost smiled in the dark. "Even now, even after everything." Then sometime past midnight, another sound. Not wood, not the settling of the frame. Something metallic, faint and resonant, like a wire vibrating in a draft. It came from above them, from somewhere on the upper floors. A single sustained tone that lasted 2 or 3 seconds and then faded into silence. Margot lay still with her eyes open. Gideon heard it too. Neither of them said anything. They lay in the dark and listened, but the sound did not come again. Margot couldn't sleep. The floor was hard and her hip ached, and the house was still a stranger to her. Sometime after 1 in the morning, she got up and walked through the first floor with the lantern. Not searching for anything, just moving through the rooms, learning their shapes the way you learn a new neighborhood by walking it. She ended up in the back corner of the parlor. The lantern light caught something she had missed during the day. A piano bench. It was oak simple with a hinged lid. No piano anywhere near it, but the bench sat alone on the hardwood, and pressed into the floor around it were 4 circular dents where piano legs had stood for years, maybe decades. Margot sat down on the bench. She lifted the lid, empty inside except for a layer of fine dust and a single piece of yellowed cloth folded neatly at the bottom. She closed the lid and sat with her hands in her lap. She had taught piano for 30 years. She'd been good at it. Not a performer, never famous, but a teacher who understood how to pass the music from her hands to someone else's. Her students had won state competitions. One earned a scholarship to Juilliard. Another played with a symphony now somewhere out west. Then the arthritis came, slowly at first, then fast. One morning she woke up and her fingers wouldn't close far enough to reach an octave. That was the end of it, not a dramatic end, just a quiet one. She stopped teaching, nobody made a fuss about it. The piano sat in the living room untouched until Mercer sold it along with everything else. She hadn't cried when Mercer sold the house. She hadn't cried when Holden changed his number. She hadn't cried when Estelle said the timing wasn't good. She cried now. Quietly in the dark, sitting on a piano bench with no piano in a house full of dust and 60 years of silence. The tears came without sound and she let them come because there was nobody to perform strength for. Just her and the dark and the bench and the 4 dents in the floor where something beautiful used to stand. Gideon found her there at first light. He didn't say anything. He sat beside her on the bench and they watched the morning come through the bay window and fill the parlor with the first sunlight that room had seen in 6 decades. After breakfast, which was crackers and bottled water, they explored the upper floors. The second story had 4 bedrooms and a bathroom, all in rough shape, wallpaper peeling in long strips, ceiling stains where the roof had leaked. But Gideon checked the walls and joists in each room, tapping and listening, and the structure held. One bedroom still had a brass bed frame pushed into the corner. Another had a tall wardrobe with a cracked mirror on its door. The third floor was smaller. The staircase narrowed as it climbed. At the top, a short hallway with 2 doors on the right side. Both opened onto small rooms, servants' quarters from the original construction, empty now except for dust and old wallpaper. At the end of the hallway there was a wall. Gideon stopped walking. Margot nearly bumped into his back. "What is it?" He was staring at the wall. It looked like any other wall in the house, plastered and papered, but something about it had caught his eye. He crouched down and ran his hand along the baseboard. "This baseboard is pine," he said. "Everything else in this house is oak." He stood and looked more closely at the wallpaper. The pattern was similar to the rest of the hallway, but not quite the same. The shade was slightly off. The repeat in the floral print was a half-inch different. "Someone put this wall up after the house was built," Gideon said. "This isn't original construction." He knocked on it with his knuckle. The sound came back hollow and thin, not the solid thud of plaster on lath on proper framing, an echo with empty air behind it. "There's a room behind this wall." Margot stood beside him. They both looked at the wall that should not have been there. At the end of a hallway where nobody had walked in longer than most people in this town had been alive. "Can you open it?" she asked. Gideon pressed his palm flat against the plaster. He held it there for a long moment. Somewhere behind the wall, through inches of plaster and wood, he could feel the faintest draft of stale, cool air pushing against his skin. "I can open it." They didn't open it that morning. Gideon needed tools he didn't have, and they both needed to eat. The crackers were gone, and the water was running low. "We'll come back to it," Gideon said, still looking at the wall. Margot stared at the plaster. "You're just gonna leave it? It's been there for 60 years. It'll keep until after breakfast." They went downstairs. Gideon was filling the last of their water bottles when there was a knock at the front door. 3 solid raps that startled them both because nobody in town knew they'd actually moved in. But it wasn't Corinne Ashworth this time. A man stood on the porch, about 72 years old, with the posture of someone who had spent years being told to stand straight and never stopped. Short gray hair, a flannel shirt buttoned to the collar, and a face that looked like it had been carved from the same wood as the porch posts. He didn't smile. He didn't introduce himself. "I heard you hammering last night," the man said. "Sorry for the noise," Gideon said. The man shook his head. It's not about the noise. I'm Harlan Holbrook. I live 3 houses down. I've been on this street 40 years. This house has been pulling the value of every property on this block down for as long as I can remember. The last person who said he was going to fix it up was 15 years ago. He pulled off 2 boards and disappeared. Left the place worse than he found it. I'm not that person, Gideon said. Harlan looked at him, looked at Margot standing behind him in the dusty foyer, looked at the sagging porch and the peeling paint and the broken window in the tower where the bird had built his nest. Everybody says that Harlan said. He turned and walked back down the steps without saying goodbye. His footsteps were even and measured the walk of a man who had learned to move through the world in straight lines and expected the world to do the same. Gideon watched him go. Then he looked back at the staircase leading up to the 3rd floor, to the hallway, to the wall that shouldn't have been there. Margot stood beside him. She didn't say anything about Harlan. She was looking at the same staircase, thinking about the same wall, and thinking about the metallic sound they'd heard in the dark the night before. The single sustained tone that had come from somewhere above them and faded into silence like a voice calling from a very long way off. Whatever was behind that wall had been waiting for 60 years. It could wait until after breakfast, but not much longer than that. Corinne Ashworth was standing on the front walk the next morning at 6:15, holding a wicker basket covered with a checkered cloth and wearing a rain jacket over one arm, even though the sky was perfectly clear. She had seen the lantern light from Prosper Street the night before, the first light in those windows in 60 years, and she had come to find out what kind of people move into a house the whole town calls haunted. Saw the glow last night, she said when Gideon opened the door. Battery lanterns, he said. Still counts. She handed him the basket. Inside were 6 blueberry muffins, a thermos of coffee, 2 red apples, and a block of cheddar cheese wrapped in wax paper. Gideon started to say she didn't need to do that, but Corinne was already past him, looking at Margot coming down the stairs in the same clothes she'd worn the day before because they were the only clothes she'd brought. Morning, how's a haunted house treating you? The floor's hard and it's cold, Margot said. But nobody's died yet. They sat on the front porch steps and ate the muffins and drank the coffee while the morning settled over the street. Corinne poured herself a cup from the thermos and sat on the top step and told them about the house without being asked, because she understood that people who sleep on the floor of a condemned building need to know whose floor they're sleeping on. Jolene Prentice, Corinne said. She was a music teacher, mostly piano, gave lessons right in that parlor for years. Her husband Sterling was career Army. He was killed in Korea in 1952. Jolene raised their daughter Darla by herself after that. Margot set her muffin down. Darla, she said. Corinne nodded. That girl was something. Everyone in town knew it. She played piano at the state fair when she was 12 years old, and people drove from 2 counties over to hear her. My mother used to talk about it. She said you could hear Darla practicing from the sidewalk on summer evenings when the windows were open and people would stop and just stand there and listen. She was that good, Gideon asked. She was that good. Jolene had her lined up for conservatory in Cincinnati. Full scholarship, everything was in place. And then she got sick. Corinne stopped. She looked at the coffee in her cup the way people look at something when they don't want to look at whoever they're talking to. What happened, Margot asked, though part of her already sensed the shape of the answer before it came. Pneumonia. She was 19. It was fast. One day Darla was there and the next she was gone. Margot looked up at the 3rd floor windows. The glass was dark behind the grime. Jolene never recovered. Corinne continued. My mother said she sealed up the 3rd floor, nailed the door shut, and then plastered right over it. Couldn't stand to look at whatever was up there. After that, she stopped teaching, stopped going to church, stopped answering the door. She lived on the 1st floor by herself for years, ate her meals alone, didn't speak to anyone unless she had to, died in her sleep at 67. The mail carrier noticed the letters piling up and called the sheriff. She'd been gone about a week, and nobody claimed the house. No family left. The county took it for back taxes. Corinne paused. The obituary in the Millfield Gazette was 2 inches long. The last line read, "Survived by no one." She finished her coffee and stood up. She looked at the porch railing missing half its spindles and at the sagging boards under her feet. "You really gonna fix this place up?" "That's the plan," Gideon said. "Then I'll be back tomorrow and the day after that. The well still works, by the way. Jolene used it until the day she died. There's a hand pump around the side near the kitchen wall." She walked down the steps, turned at the sidewalk, and left the way she'd come, with the empty basket on her arm and the rain jacket she didn't need folded over the other. Gideon found the pump exactly where Corinne described it. Cast iron, old but solid. He primed it with the last of their bottled water and worked the handle until it caught. Brown water first, then clear. He let it run for 5 minutes before filling a jug. "We have water," he told Margot when he came back inside. "We have a house and we have water. That's more than we had 3 days ago." The next morning, a kid showed up. He was maybe 17, tall and thin, wearing a baseball cap pulled low over his eyes and work boots that had seen real use. He stood at the end of the front walk with his hands in his jacket pockets and watched Gideon measuring the porch railing for nearly 10 minutes before he said a word. "You need help with that." Gideon looked up from his tape measure. "Depends. You know how to hold a level. I know which end goes up. That's a start. Come here." His name was Judson Dunmore. He lived 4 houses down with his grandmother, who was 78 and on oxygen. He dropped out of school the year before to take care of her. He worked odd jobs when he could find them. Mowing, clearing gutters, hauling trash for the neighbors. "What are you paying?" Judson asked as he climbed the porch steps. $15 an hour and everything I know about structural engineering." "I don't need to know about structural engineering." "You might. Hold this board steady." Gideon taught the way he'd always taught, which was by working. He didn't lecture. He showed Judson how to measure, how to mark a cut line with a pencil, how to check for level. When Judson got a measurement wrong, Gideon didn't correct him. He just said, "Check it again." Judson checked. "Off by a 1/4 inch. "So what do you do?" Judson asked. "Cut a new board. Or shim it." "A 1/4 inch isn't a new board, it's a shim. You waste material on a 1/4 inch, you'll run out of lumber before you run out of house." Judson understood that kind of thinking. He'd been running a household on almost nothing for more than a year. Gideon held up the old yellow level he'd bought for $3 at Dalton's hardware store. He pointed to the glass vial in the center, where a small bubble of air floated between 2 lines. "When that bubble sits dead center, the surface is true. The world is straight, and when it's not centered, something needs adjusting. This level doesn't lie. It's the most honest tool you'll ever hold." They worked together for 3 days on the porch. New posts where the old ones had rotted. New boards where the flooring had gone soft. The front steps rebuilt from scratch with treated lumber that Dalton put on the store account without being asked. By the end of the 3rd day, every railing post was plumb, every board was tight, and Margot could walk up the front steps without testing each one with her foot first. "You did that," Gideon told Judson as they stood on the sidewalk looking at the finished porch. "We did that." "No, you did the work. I just held the level." On the morning of the 4th day, Gideon was up before dawn. He laid out his tools on the 3rd-floor hallway by the time Margot came up the stairs with 2 mugs of coffee brewed on the camp stove Judson had brought over the day before. A hammer, a pry bar, a cold chisel, a flashlight. Judson arrived at 7 and stood at the end of the hallway looking at the wall with an expression Gideon recognized because he'd worn it himself. "There's really a room back there," Judson said. "There's really a room." "How do you know?" "Different baseboard, different wallpaper, and I can feel air coming through." Gideon picked up the chisel and placed it against the plaster at the seam where the false wall met the original framing. He struck it with the hammer, and a chunk of white plaster fell to the floor, trailing a cloud of fine dust. He struck again. Each blow opened the wall a little more. Behind the plaster was a layer of lath-thin wooden strips nailed horizontally. Behind the lath was a gap of about 4 inches. And behind that, visible in the flashlight beam through the broken plaster, was a door. "There it is," Judson said. Gideon cleared enough plaster and lath to expose the full door. It was heavy oak, darker than the rest of the woodwork in the house. A 6-panel door with a brass knob and a brass keyhole. The knob was tarnished nearly black. Margot stood behind them in the hallway, both hands wrapped around her coffee mug. Gideon tried the knob. It turned, but the door didn't move. Locked. He looked at the keyhole, then up at the door frame. He ran his hand along the top of the frame, where a thin ledge of molding created a narrow shelf. His fingers brushed something small and metal, heavy with dust. A key, brassled with a simple notch blade. Jolene had sealed the room. She had plastered over the door and hidden it behind a false wall. But she had left the key right there, an inch above the frame, where anyone who opened the wall would find it. She couldn't go in, but she couldn't lock it away forever either. Gideon fitted the key into the lock. It resisted, then turned with a click that echoed in the quiet hallway. He pushed the door open. A rush of stale air came through the doorway, cool and dry, carrying a smell that was different from the rest of the house. Not dust and old wood, something closer to paper and varnish and dried flowers. And underneath that, the faintest trace of something Gideon now understood. The metallic resonance they'd heard their first night. Not a ghost, not the house settling. The draft from the hallway traveling through the gap in the false wall, finding its way to whatever was inside this room and making it sing. Gideon stepped in first. Judson and Margot followed. The room was large, larger than they'd expected. It ran the full width of the house on the east side with 2 tall windows that looked out over the street. Both windows were intact, the glass streaked with decades of grime, but unbroken. The morning light filtered through in pale golden bars that fell across the floor. In the center of the room, covered by a white cotton sheet that had yellowed with age, was a shape they all recognized immediately. A grand piano. Along the walls, on every flat surface, stacked on chairs and on the floor, and on a low bookshelf under the windows, were piles of paper. Sheet music, handwritten ink on staff paper, hundreds of pages. Against the far wall stood a writing desk, small walnut, with a single drawer and a slanted top. On the desk, placed precisely in the center, was a sealed envelope. Nobody spoke for a long moment. The room did not feel abandoned. It felt like a place that had been waiting. "This was Darla's room," Margot said quietly. Gideon walked to the desk and picked up the envelope. On the front, in careful handwriting that had faded to a light brown, were 4 words. "To whoever finds this." He looked at Margot. She nodded. He opened the envelope carefully, sliding his thumb under the flap. The paper was brittle. Inside was a letter, 2 pages written in the same careful hand. He read it aloud. Judson leaned against the doorframe. Margot stood by the piano with one hand resting on the sheet. "My name is Jolene Prentice. I am writing this letter in February of 1959, 1 year after the death of my daughter, Darla Ann Prentice, who was 19 years old. Darla was a pianist. That is not enough to say. Darla was music itself. She heard things in the silence that the rest of us could not. She played her first recital at 8. She won the state competition at 12. By 15, she had been accepted to the conservatory in Cincinnati on a full scholarship to begin when she turned 18. In the fall of 1955, when she was 16, Darla was in an accident. A horse cart on the county road lost a wheel and struck her on the left side. Her left hand was badly injured. The doctors said she would regain most of the use, but the fine motor control, the speed and precision that a concert pianist requires, would not come back fully. Darla did not stop. She did not complain. She sat at this piano the day she came home from the hospital with her left hand bandaged and swollen, and she began to compose. What she wrote was unlike anything I had ever heard. She composed music for hands that could not do what healthy hands could do. Wider fingerings, simplified chord voicings that still sounded full and rich, pieces that a pianist with limited strength and reduced reach could play without pain and without the music suffering for it. She said she was writing for every pianist who had been told they could not play anymore. She composed for 3 years, over 40 pieces for solo piano, several for piano and violin, a few for small ensembles, each one annotated in her own hand with notes about the adapted fingerings and the reasons behind each choice. Darla died of pneumonia on March the 14th, 1958. She was 19 years old. It happened in 4 days. She was composing at this desk on a Monday and she was gone by Friday. I have sealed this room because I cannot bear to enter it, but I cannot destroy what she created. It is all I have left of her, and it is all she left of herself. In the drawer of this desk, you will find a bank book. I have placed $800 in a trust account at the savings bank in town. It is Sterling's insurance settlement in every dollar I had. I have asked that it remain in the account until someone finds this room. The money is for this house and for music education for those who need it most. If you are reading this letter, then someone has opened this room. I do not know who you are or how you found it, but I believe you were meant to find it. Please let the music live. Jolene Prince, February 1959. Gideon folded the letter and placed it back on the desk. His hands were steady, but his jaw was tight. Judson hadn't moved from the doorway. He was looking at the stacks of sheet music with an expression Gideon couldn't read. Margot was crying. She wasn't making a sound. Tears ran down her face and she didn't wipe them away. She was looking at the piano under its yellowed sheet. She stepped forward and took hold of the sheet with both hands. She pulled it off in one slow motion and it slid to the floor in a pile of faded cotton. The piano was a Steinway Model B, 7 feet long ebony case. The finish was dull from decades of still air, but the wood was intact. No cracks, no warping. The room had been sealed tight enough that the temperature and humidity had barely changed in 60 years. Margot lifted the fallboard. The keys were yellowed ivory, the sharps a dark brown. She pressed middle C with her index finger. The note came out slightly flat and with a soft, muffled quality, but it came out. The hammer still struck the string. The string still vibrated. "It needs tuning," she said, "but it works." She sat down on the bench, a real piano bench this time, with a cushioned top that matched the instrument. She adjusted her position the way she had 10,000 times in her life. On the music stand above the keys, someone had left a composition open. The title was written in Darla's handwriting at the top of the first page, "For Hands That Remember." Margot looked at the notation. She read through the first 8 bars, her eyes moving across the staff lines. Her mouth opened slightly. "Gideon, the fingerings, look at the fingerings. These aren't normal. The intervals are wider." She's using the thumb and second finger, where a standard arrangement would use the 4th and 5th. The chord voicings are spread differently. She designed these for someone with limited reach in the ring and pinky fingers. Margot placed her hands on the keys, her swollen knuckles, her stiff joints, the fingers that hadn't reached an octave in 5 years. She played the first chord. It sounded full, open, rich, and her fingers reached every note. She played the second chord, then the third, then the first phrase. The melody rose from the old piano, thin and slightly out of tune but clear. A melody that was warm and simple on the surface but built in complexity as it moved forward. And Margot's hands followed it because Darla had put every note exactly where damaged hands could find them. She played for 10 minutes, 3 compositions, sight reading them from the yellowed pages. Each one was written for hands like hers, not simplified, not dumbed down. Full, complex, beautiful music arranged so that a pianist with arthritis or injury or age-stiffened joints could play without pain and without compromise. When she stopped, the silence in the room was different from the silence that had been there before. Before, it was the silence of a place sealed shut. Now it was the silence of a place that had been opened. Judson was sitting on the top step of the staircase just outside the door, his baseball cap in his hands. He spoke quietly, almost to himself. My grandmother used to sing in the church choir. She had a beautiful voice. Then she got the lung disease and couldn't sing anymore. She never talks about it. But I hear her crying on Sunday mornings when the hymns come on the radio. Nobody responded. There was nothing to say that would have been better than what he'd said. 3 days later, Gideon was on the roof patching one of the soft spots near the chimney. Judson was below cutting boards for the second porch railing. The sky had been clear all morning, but the weather in that part of the country could turn without warning. By 2 in the afternoon, a line of dark clouds had rolled in from the west, and by 2:30, the wind had picked up enough to make the elm trees on Prosper Street bend sideways. Gideon was pulling a rotted section of decking when the first gust hit. It came hard and sudden, catching the loose sheet of old roofing material he'd been working under and ripping it upward like a sail. The sheet swung wide and struck Gideon across the right shoulder, knocking him off balance. He slid 3 feet down the wet roof before his hand caught the gutter. The gutter held, but his shoulder did not. He felt something pull and separate in the joint, a hot, bright pain that traveled down his arm and locked his fingers into a grip he couldn't release. Judson heard the sound of the sheet tearing loose and was on the second-floor landing in 30 seconds. He climbed out through the window and found Gideon hanging from the gutter, with one hand, rain already sheeting across the roof in gray curtains. "Give me your other hand," Judson said. "Can't move it." Judson grabbed Gideon's belt with both hands and pulled him through the window frame. They fell together onto the hallway floor, soaking wet. Gideon's right arm hung at an angle that wasn't right. Below them, the section of roof where Gideon had been working was gone. The wind had torn a 6-foot hole in the decking, and rain was pouring through onto the third-floor hallway. Directly outside Darla's room, Margot was already on the stairs. She saw the water running down the hallway toward the open door, and she ran. She and Judson spent the next 2 hours covering the hole with the heaviest tarps they could find, nailing them down in the rain, while Gideon sat against the wall, cradling his arm and directing them by shouting over the wind. When the rain stopped and they went inside to assess the damage, Margot found 4 pages of Darla's sheet music on the hallway floor, soaked through. Not complete compositions, fragments. But she picked up each one as carefully as if it were a living thing and spent the rest of the night kneeling on the floor of Darla's room, blotting each page with a dry cloth and laying them flat to dry in the still air. Gideon's shoulder was dislocated, not broken. A neighbor 2 streets over, who had been a paramedic, set it back into place the next morning. But the joint was badly bruised and the muscles around it were torn, and Gideon could not lift his right arm above his waist for at least 2 weeks. He could not climb. He could not swing a hammer. He could not do the work that was keeping this house alive. That night, he sat on the front porch step in the dark. His arm was in a sling made from a dish towel. Margot came out and sat beside him. They listened to the water dripping from the damaged eaves. "Maybe Mercer is right," Gideon said. His voice was low, barely above the sound of the dripping water. Margot looked at him. "I'm 74 years old. I fell off a roof. I can't keep my own house, and I'm trying to keep someone else's." Margot was quiet for a long time. The street was dark. A porch light was on at Judson's grandmother's house 4 doors down. "You didn't fall," she said. You were pushed. Those are two different things. Gideon looked at her. Falling is when your feet can't hold you. Being pushed is when something bigger than you comes along. You still held on. You grabbed that gutter and you held. You're still here. He didn't say anything else, but the next morning before dawn, he was at the kitchen table with his left hand and a pencil redrawing the repair plans on a fresh sheet of graph paper. For 2 weeks, Judson worked alone on the roof. Gideon sat below and called instructions up through the window describing angles and measurements and the order of operations for replacing decking boards. Judson measured and cut and nailed. He checked the bubble in the level before every board went down, holding the yellow tool flat against the wood and waiting until the bubble settled. He didn't need to be told. He remembered. The roof wasn't perfect, but it didn't leak, and that was enough. When Gideon's shoulder had healed enough for him to walk to town, he put on his cleanest shirt, tucked Jolene's bank book into his jacket pocket, and went to the savings bank on Main Street. It was a small brick building with green shutters and a brass plaque by the door that said established 1897. The teller, a young woman named Nadine, typed the account number into her computer. She typed it again. She picked up the phone and asked the manager to come out. Nolan Whitford was a man in his 60s with a gray suit and reading glasses that he kept pushing up his nose. He sat Gideon down in his office, turned the computer screen around, and showed him a number. $800 deposited in February of 1958. Trust account with explicit instructions. The account moved from a basic savings instrument to a certificate of deposit in '71, then into a conservative bond fund in 1989. Every transition followed the trust's original terms. Safe, low risk, steady growth. $127,000.41. Gideon sat back in his chair. Two permitted uses, Nolan said. Maintenance and restoration of the property at 14 Prosper Street and music education for those who need it most. The funds cannot be withdrawn for personal use. She thought of everything Gideon said. She had a good lawyer or a very clear mind, possibly both. Gideon walked home with the bank book in his jacket and the manager's card in his pocket. He told Margot the number. He told her the terms. $127,000, she said, and 41 cents. For the house and for music. For the house and for music. 1 week later, a letter arrived from the Millfield County Planning Office. It was signed by Willa Torrance, County Planning Inspector, and it informed Gideon and Margot Crandall that the property at 14 Prosper Street remained classified as condemned under county code. The trust account associated with the property had been placed on administrative hold, pending resolution of the property's legal status. Gideon read the letter twice. Then he drove to the county office and sat across from Willa Torrance in a small room with fluorescent lights and a filing cabinet that took up half the floor space. Willa was about 50 with short brown hair and a pen clip to the pocket of her blouse. She spoke the way someone speaks when they have said the same thing many times and know it will not be received well. Mr. Crandall, I understand your situation, but I cannot authorize the release of trust funds for a property that is officially condemned. If someone is injured on that property and funds have been disbursed, the county assumes liability. You purchased the house at tax auction, but the condemnation order was never lifted. To lift it, I need a structural certification from a licensed engineer currently in practice. Your license expired 9 years ago. I have 40 years of experience, Gideon said, and a license that expired in 2015. I need a practicing engineer to sign off. Gideon drove home and sat at the kitchen table. He did the math. A licensed structural inspection would cost $2,000 to $3,000. The money was in the trust account. The trust account was frozen. The account was frozen because the house was condemned. The house was condemned because there was no inspection. And they couldn't pay for the inspection because the account was frozen. That evening, Margot said what they were both thinking. We need the money to prove the house is safe, but the money is locked until the house is proven safe. Gideon looked at the ceiling. I'll find a way, he said. But his voice had less iron in it than usual, and Margot heard the difference. 2 days later, Sullivan Selby's truck pulled up in front of the house. He got out and walked up the front path with his hands in his pockets and a look on his face that was almost friendly, which made it worse. Mr. Crandall, he said, standing on the rebuilt porch and looking around at the new posts and the tight boards with an appraiser's eye. I admire what you're doing here. I do. But let's be practical. You're 74, your shoulder is injured, your trust fund is frozen, the house is still condemned. I'll offer you $15,000 for the property. That's more than 1,000 times what you paid. You and your wife can rent a decent apartment in the next town over. Heat, air conditioning, a bathroom that works. Gideon looked at him. No. Sullivan's expression shifted. The friendliness didn't leave, but something harder moved behind it. You sure about that? Because I could also have a conversation with Mrs. Torrance about the fact that a condemned property currently has 2 elderly residents living in it without a certificate of occupancy. That's a code violation that could result in a mandatory vacate order. You can talk to whoever you want, Gideon said. I'm not selling. Sullivan studied him for a moment. You're more stubborn than the situation calls for, he said. Maybe, but it's my house. Sullivan walked back to his truck. He didn't look angry. He looked patient, the way a man looks when he knows the math is on his side and all he has to do is wait. That evening, Gideon told Corinne about the inspection, about the frozen trust, about Sullivan's visit. He told her at the counter of the diner while she wiped down the coffee machine and listened without interrupting. A few other customers were scattered around the room. At the far end of the counter, Harlan Holbrook sat alone with a cup of black coffee, reading a newspaper. He didn't look up, but he didn't turn the page either. 2 days later, Harlan knocked on Gideon's door. He stood on the porch with his hands at his sides and his back straight, the same posture as the first time, but something in his face was different. Softer maybe, or just tired of being hard. My grandson is a structural engineer, he said. Works in Springfield. I called him last night. He's coming out this weekend. He'll do the inspection. I'll pay for it. Gideon looked at him. Wait, because you asked me if I'd ever been hurt and kept going. I have. I understand what that costs. He turned and walked back down the steps the same way he'd come the first time, measured and straight. But at the sidewalk, he stopped and turned back. And because that porch is the best carpentry work I've seen on this street in 40 years, whoever built it knew what they were doing. Then he was gone. Harlan's grandson came that Saturday. He spent 4 hours going through every room, every floor, every wall and joist and foundation stone. He signed the certification that evening at Corinne's diner, with Corinne pouring coffee and Gideon watching the pen move across the paper the way he used to watch his own pen move across inspection reports, with the understanding that what was being written down mattered more than most things that got written down. Willa Torrance reviewed the certification on Monday. She called Gideon on Tuesday. The hold is lifted, she said. The trust funds are available. Gideon hung up the phone. He walked to the kitchen where Margot was washing dishes. She saw his face and set the plate down. The money's free, he said. Margot leaned against the counter and closed her eyes. When she opened them, she said the only thing that mattered: go upstairs and play something. That evening, Margot opened the windows on the 3rd floor for the first time since they'd broken through the wall. She sat at Darla's piano and played a piece titled "Letter to Someone I Haven't Met." The music traveled out through the open windows and down to the street, carried on the warm evening air. Corinne Ashworth was locking up the diner when she heard it. She stopped on the sidewalk with the keys in her hand and did not move. She stood there with one hand pressed against her chest, and when she finally spoke, it was to nobody but the evening. "That's Darla," she said. "I never heard her play, but my mother described it 100 times. She said it sounded like someone talking to you from a very long way off." Down the street on the porch of his grandmother's house, Judson sat on the steps and listened. Inside, his grandmother had fallen asleep in her chair with the oxygen tube running to her nose and the radio turned low. He didn't wake her. He just sat and listened to the music coming through the windows of a house he had helped rebuild. And he thought about voices that get taken away and the people who spend the rest of their lives listening for them. Judson counted the compositions the next morning. He moved carefully through Darla's room, sorting pages into groups. Each composition had a title page in Darla's handwriting. He made a pile on the floor for each one. 43, he said after 20 minutes. 43 complete compositions. 31 for solo piano, 7 for piano and violin, 3 for piano and cello, 2 for a small ensemble. 43 pieces in 3 years, Margot said. She was writing as fast as she could, Gideon said. She knew, Margot said. She might not have known about the pneumonia, but she knew her hand was getting worse. She was writing against a clock she couldn't see. Gideon looked at the letter on the desk at the piano, at the stacks of yellowed pages that a 19-year-old girl had filled with music no one had heard in 66 years. Jolene said whoever found this room was meant to find it, he said. I don't believe in things like that, Margot said. Neither do I, but a piano teacher who can't play anymore just sat down in a dead girl's room and played music that a dead girl wrote 60 years ago for exactly the kind of hands this piano teacher has. I don't know what to call that, but I'm not going to argue with it. Margot looked at the piano. She looked at the stacks of sheet music. She looked at her own hands, swollen and stiff and somehow impossibly still, capable of making music. Because a girl she never met had written it for her decades before she was born in a room that had been sealed and waiting and silent until the right person came along with the right kind of damage to understand what was inside. The work changed after the trust was released. Not in kind, but in scale. Gideon stopped patching and started rebuilding. He drew up complete plans on graph paper at the kitchen table, room by room, floor by floor, using the structural map he had been carrying in his head since the first hour he walked through the front door. Judson worked every morning starting at 7. Gideon paid him from the trust at a fair hourly rate, and the boy never missed a day. They replaced the roof over 2 weeks. Judson did the climbing. Gideon directed from below, calling measurements up through the second-floor window, his voice carrying across the yard with the precision of a man who had spent 4 decades making himself understood on loud job sites. An electrician from the next town over came and rewired the first 2 floors. He charged half his normal rate. My grandmother played piano, he said. Can't say no to a story about a piano. The plumber from the Baptist church came back and ran new copper lines to the second-floor bathroom. He wouldn't take payment. He said to consider it his contribution to the cause. A retired carpenter from the edge of town showed up one Saturday with a truckload of salvaged trim molding and spent the afternoon fitting it to the parlor door frames without being asked. When Gideon tried to thank him, the man shrugged and said he'd been driving past that house for 30 years and was tired of looking at it broken. By the end of the 3rd week, the Victorian had running water on 2 floors, electricity in every room, and a roof that held against the spring rain that came through on a Tuesday night without a single drop reaching the 3rd-floor hallway. Gideon painted the exterior himself with Judson on the ladder. Corinne appeared on the 2nd day with sandwiches and opinions about the color. Not that blue, she said, looking at the first test patch Gideon had rolled onto the front siding. Margot came to the door. I found a photograph at the library. The original house was white with dark green trim. They went with white and dark green. While the house came together around her, Margot played. Every morning before the construction noise started, she climbed to the third floor and sat at Darla's piano and worked through another composition. A piano tuner from the county seat had come out and spent 4 hours bringing the Steinway back to concert pitch. He charged $50 and asked if he could come back sometime to hear someone play it. Margot started with the simpler pieces exercises designed for hands rebuilding strength. Darla had organized her work in a progression from basic pieces requiring modest reach and gentle pressure through intermediate compositions that demanded coordination and expression, all the way to concert-level works that asked for real musicianship while still accommodating limited mobility. It was not a random collection. It was a curriculum, a complete method for teaching piano to people whose hands didn't work the way textbooks assumed they should. Margot's fingers would never be what they were at 40, but Darla's music didn't ask them to be what they were at 40. It asked them to be what they were now, and it made something beautiful with that. One Tuesday afternoon, a woman knocked on the front door with a girl of about 11 standing behind her. The woman had the weathered look of someone who worked outdoors, and the girl stood with her chin raised and her eyes fixed on Margot with an expression that had nothing soft in it. "Are you the piano teacher?" the woman asked. Margot hadn't called herself that in 5 years. "I used to be. My daughter Odette wants to learn. She's got a situation with her right hand." The girl held up her hand without being asked. The third and fourth fingers were stiff-scarred and slightly bent inward. A farming accident from the look of it. "We drove to 2 teachers in the county," the woman said. "Both of them said she'd never play properly. Then I heard about you and the music you found." Margot looked at the girl. Odette Wyndham looked back at her with the stubborn expression of someone who had been told no and had decided that no was not the final word on the subject. "Come in," Margot said. She started Odette on Darla's beginning exercises that same afternoon. Within 20 minutes, the girl was playing simple melodies with both hands. Her damaged fingers found the adapted positions that Darla had designed, and the notes came out clean and full. The girl smiled for the first time since she'd walked through the door, and it was the kind of smile that changes the temperature in a room. 2 more students came that week, then 3 more. Margot taught in the parlor on a donated upright piano that Corinne's church had been keeping in a storage room. She reserved the Steinway for advanced work and for her own playing, which she did every evening after the students had gone home and the house was quiet. The complaint from Sullivan Selby arrived in the mail on a Wednesday morning during the second week of Margot's teaching. It was 3 pages long, typed on legal letterhead, and it argued that the tax auction sale of 14 Prosper Street was procedurally defective because a condemned property should not have been sold to a private individual for residential occupancy without a pre-sale structural assessment. If the complaint was upheld, the sale would be voided and the property would return to auction. Gideon read it at the kitchen table. He read it again. Then he folded it and put it in his jacket pocket and walked to the county planning office. Willa Torrance was waiting for him, and she had a copy of the complaint on her desk and a look on her face that Gideon had not seen before. The first time they'd met, she had been the obstacle. Now she was something else. "Mr. Crandall, this complaint has a thin legal basis, but it is not without standing. The sale was conducted under standard tax auction procedures, but the complainant is correct that the property was condemned at the time of sale and that no structural assessment was performed prior to the auction." She folded her hands on the desk. "Here is what I can do. If the property passes a full habitability inspection within 30 days, I will issue a formal rescission of the condemnation order and dismiss the complaint. If it does not pass, I am required to take the complaint under formal review." 30 days, Gideon said. 30 days. Gideon walked home and told Margot and Judson and Corinne, who happened to be in the kitchen making sandwiches for No reason other than that she had decided the kitchen was partly hers now. 30 days became the only number that mattered. Judson worked from dawn to dark. The plumber came back. The electrician came back. Harlan Holbrook appeared on the second morning with a paint roller and a gallon of white semigloss and went upstairs to the second-floor bathroom without saying a word to anyone. He painted the walls and the ceiling and the trim around the window, and when Gideon found him there at noon and asked him why Harlan set the roller in the tray and looked at him. "Because this is my street," he said, "and this is the best house on it." Dalton Langford at the hardware store tore up the credit ledger. He handed Gideon the shredded pieces in an envelope. "Paid in full," he said. "Don't argue with me." On the 28th day, Willa Torrance arrived at 8 in the morning with a clipboard and a flashlight and a tape measure. She went through every room on every floor. She checked electrical outlets and water pressure and stair railings and window locks and smoke detectors and the structural joints in the basement and the flashing around the chimney and the ventilation in the attic space above the third floor. She spent 3 hours in the house and did not speak during any of them, except to ask Gideon to open a door or turn on a faucet. When she was finished, she stood on the front porch. She looked at the rebuilt railings and the new steps and the fresh paint white with dark green trim. She looked at the flower beds along the front walk that the women from Corinne's church had planted the week before. She looked at the 2 dogwood trees in the side yard that a man from the garden club had donated. "Mr. Crandall, the property passes inspection. I will issue the rescission of the condemnation order today and file a dismissal of Mr. Selby's complaint." She put the cap on her pen and clipped it to her clipboard. Then she paused. "And if Mrs. Crandall has room for one more student, my niece just moved to town. She's 9 years old." The week after Willa dismissed the complaint, Odette's mother came to pick her up early from a lesson. She stood in the parlor doorway with her jacket on and her keys in her hand and an expression that was trying hard to be polite. "Mrs. Crandall, I appreciate what you're doing for Odette. I do, but I heard from someone in town that this property was in some kind of legal dispute, that there was a man trying to have the sale reversed. If something like that could happen again, I'm not sure I should be bringing my daughter here." Margot knew immediately where the talk had started. Sullivan Selby had been spreading doubt before Willa shut him down, and the echo of it was still moving through town the way gossip does, slower than the truth, but louder. "The complaint was filed and dismissed," Margot said. "The county inspector signed off on this house herself. You can call the planning office and confirm it." The woman hesitated. Behind her, Odette was still sitting at the upright piano. She hadn't gotten up when her mother arrived. She was playing the first 4 bars of a piece called "Morning Walk," slowly and carefully, her scarred fingers finding every note, with the quiet determination of someone who has learned that the world does not hand you things and that whatever you want, you will have to reach for with the hands you have. Odette's mother watched her daughter's hands on the keys. She didn't say anything else. She sat down in the chair by the door and waited until the lesson was over. The next Tuesday, Odette came back. She came back every Tuesday and Thursday after that. On a Wednesday afternoon, 6 weeks after the trust was released, a black sedan pulled up to the curb in front of the house. Gideon was on the porch replacing a section of decorative trim that Judson had cut from a template Gideon had traced from one of the surviving original pieces. He heard the car door and looked up. Mercer stepped out of the driver's side. He was thinner than the last time Gideon had seen him, and his hair was shorter, and something in his posture had changed in a way Gideon couldn't name. A woman got out of the passenger side carrying a leather portfolio. Gideon didn't recognize her. Mercer walked up the front path. He stopped at the bottom of the porch steps and looked at the house. His expression shifted as he took in the transformation, the new paint, the solid porch, the repaired windows, the clean gutters, the flower beds, the brass plaque from the County Historic Preservation Office mounted on the front gate post. Dad, Mercer, the place looks different. The place is different. Mercer came up the steps. The woman with the portfolio followed. Judson was kneeling by the railing with a sanding block in his hand. He looked at Mercer, then at Gideon, and stayed where he was. "Who's your friend?" Gideon asked. "She's an associate. She works in historic property assessment." "Did she come to assess the property?" Mercer put his hands in his pockets. Gideon recognized the gesture. It was the same one Mercer had made as a teenager when he was about to ask for something he knew he shouldn't ask for. Some things a father never forgets about his children, no matter what those children become. "Dad, can we talk inside?" They sat at the kitchen table. Margot came down from the third floor when she heard Mercer's voice. She stood in the kitchen doorway and did not sit down. "Mom," Mercer said. "Mercer." He looked at her for a moment. Then he looked away. He turned to Gideon. "I heard about the house, about what you found up there. The piano, the music, the bank account. It was in the county paper." "How did you hear?" Margot asked. "A friend forwarded it to me." "A friend," Margot said. The words sat in the air between them like a stone dropped into still water. Mercer leaned forward in his chair. "Look, I came because I think there's an opportunity here. This house with the story attached to it with the historic designation is worth real money. I've talked to people. The property alone on this lot with the original Victorian architecture is worth $200,000 on the low end. With the Prentice story and the media attention, you could get more. I know a developer who would make an offer this week." He paused as if what he was about to say next was a kindness. "We could sell, split the proceeds, and set you and Mom up somewhere comfortable. A real place. Heat, air conditioning, a bathroom that doesn't smell like copper pipes." The kitchen was quiet. The refrigerator hummed. Outside, Judson had stopped sanding. "I have a comfortable place," Gideon said. "Dad, you're 74 years old. You're living in a house you bought for $12. The electrical was done by a licensed electrician, and I like the way copper pipes smell." Mercer looked at his mother. "Mom talked to him." Margot pulled out a chair and sat down across from her son. She placed her hands on the table. Her swollen knuckles, her stiff fingers, the hands that had lost everything and found it again in a dead girl's room on the third floor. She let him see them. "Mercer, do you remember when I stopped teaching piano? That was years ago, 5 years ago. Do you know what you said to me when I told you I couldn't teach anymore?" Mercer did not answer. "You said, well, it's not like it was paying the bills anyway. That's what you said to your mother on the phone the week she lost the thing that mattered most to her in the world." Mercer looked at the table. "And then you sold my piano without asking. You told the movers to deal with it, and they sold it for $75 to a second-hand shop on Route 9. I called them. They remembered the piano. They said a man in a nice suit dropped it off and said his mother didn't need it anymore. Mom, I was trying to manage a complicated situation. You sold my mother's wedding ring." The room went very still. Not the stillness of an empty room. The stillness of a room where something has been said that cannot be unsaid. "You took it from my jewelry box the day before the house closed. I heard the hinge. I heard you open it. I thought you were looking for paperwork. You drove to a pawn shop and sold it for $400. I know because I called every pawn shop within 50 miles. The one on Meridian Street remembered you. Blue suit, nice car. Said it was his mother's ring and she wouldn't miss it." Mercer's face had gone white, not red, not angry, white. The color of face turns when a person sees themselves clearly for the first time in a long time and does not like what they see. "That ring was the only thing I had left of my mother," Margot said. "And you sold it for $400 because you thought I wouldn't notice or that I wouldn't care or that it didn't matter. Because I was just your mother, and mothers don't get to have things that matter." She folded her hands on the table. Her voice was steady, not angry, something beyond anger, something that had passed through anger and come out the other side into a kind of clarity that could not be argued with. This house is not for sale, Mercer. Darla's music is not for sale, and we are not going anywhere. Jolene left this house for someone who would take care of it, and she left that music for someone who would let it live. That someone is us. I play that piano every day. I teach children on it. I have a girl who was told she would never play, and she's playing Darla's music with 2 damaged fingers, and she doesn't miss a single note. That is worth more than any number your developer friend can write on a check. Mercer stood up. His associate, who had sat silently through the entire conversation with her leather portfolio unopened on her lap, stood up too. "This is a mistake," Mercer said, but his voice had no force behind it. It was the voice of a man who knows he has already lost, but hasn't yet found the grace to say so. "You're welcome to think so," Margot said. Mercer walked to the front door. He put his hand on the knob. He didn't turn around. He stood there for a long moment, with his back to his parents and his hand on the doorknob of a house he had never helped build and would never own, and whatever he was feeling in that moment, he kept to himself. He opened the door and walked out. Gideon followed him onto the porch. Mercer was already on the front walk, moving toward his car. His associate walked beside him, clutching her portfolio. "Mercer," his son stopped. He didn't turn. "When you're ready to be my son again, the door is open." Mercer stood there. The afternoon light came in through the elm trees and fell across the front walk in shifting patterns. Judson was still kneeling by the railing. He had the sanding block in his hand, forgotten. Mercer got in his car. His associate got in the other side. They drove away down the street. Gideon stood on the porch for a long time. Judson asked quietly if he was all right. Gideon said he was. Then he sat down on the step and lowered his head into his hands, and his shoulders shook once, twice, 3 times. It lasted maybe 5 seconds. Then he straightened up and wiped his eyes with the back of his hand and looked at the house, at the new paint and the straight railings and the windows with their clean glass, and he set his jaw the way he always did when something hurt, but didn't kill him. Judson saw it. He didn't say anything. He picked up the sanding block and went back to work. 2 weeks after Mercer's visit, a plain white envelope arrived in the mail. No letter, no note, no return address printed on the envelope. Just a check inside. The amount was generous. The memo line was blank. Gideon recognized the handwriting on the envelope. He sat at the kitchen table and looked at the check for a long time. Then he folded it carefully and walked upstairs to Darla's room. He lifted the lid of the piano bench and placed the check inside next to the yellow cloth that had been there when Margot first found the bench on their first night in the house. He didn't tell Margot. He didn't cash it. Maybe someday he would. Or maybe someday Mercer would come back and they could talk about what it meant. For now, it sat in the piano bench, which seemed like the right place for things that were waiting to be understood. The phone call came on a Tuesday evening. Margot was washing dishes after a lesson when her cell phone buzzed on the counter, an unfamiliar number with a familiar area code. She dried her hands and answered, "Mom." She knew the voice immediately. Holden, the son who had changed his number. The son who had texted about senior communities. The son who hadn't spoken to them in 5 months. "Mom, it's me." "I know who it is," she said. A long pause. She could hear him breathing. "I saw the article about the house, about what you and Dad found." "Your father and I?" "Yes." "Mom, I'm sorry. I know that's not enough. I know saying it doesn't fix anything. But I'm sorry. I should have called months ago. I should have called the day Mercer told me what he'd done. I should have driven over and picked you up and told him he was wrong. I didn't, and I've been sitting with that every day since." "Why didn't you?" Another pause longer. "Because it was easier not to. Because Mercer handled everything, and I let him. And by the time I realized what had happened, it felt too late to say anything. Margot watched Gideon through the kitchen window. He was in the side yard stacking the last of the old lumber into a neat pile for the neighbor who used it for firewood. He picked up a piece of scrap wood, turned it over, decided it was worth keeping for something, and set it aside. "Can I come see the house?" Holden asked. "I don't need to stay. I just want to see what you've built. I want to hear you play." "It's always been your house too," Margot said. Her voice cracked on the last word. "Just slightly. Just enough. Come Saturday. Bring nothing. Just yourself." She hung up and stood in the kitchen for a while. She didn't cry. She put the phone in her pocket, dried the last dish, and went upstairs to play. A month after they had opened the sealed room, a woman called from the state university, Dr. Colleen Bracken, professor of music education. She had heard about the compositions through the piano tuner who had told his wife, who had told a colleague, who had told the professor. She drove 2 hours on a Saturday and spent the entire day in Darla's room. She wore cotton gloves and handled each page with the care of someone who understood what she was holding. She photographed every composition. She read Jolene's letter 3 times. At the end of the day, she sat in the parlor with Gideon and Margot and a cup of Corinne's coffee. "I've spent my career studying adaptive music pedagogy," she said. "The field barely existed before the 1970s. There are maybe a dozen significant early works in the entire literature. What Darla Prentice wrote in this room between 1955 and 1958 predates all of them. She wasn't just composing music. She was inventing a method of teachings that the rest of the world wouldn't arrive at for another 20 years. Several of these pieces are genuinely beautiful works of music in their own right, regardless of the adaptive elements. With your permission, I'd like to bring a colleague from the conservatory to evaluate the collection for publication." Margot looked at the letter on the desk. She thought about the woman who wrote it alone in this house, sealing her daughter's room because she couldn't bear to see it and couldn't bear to destroy it. "Jolene wanted the music to live," Margot said. "So yes, all of it." The spring recital was held on the first Saturday in May. Margot had her students prepare one composition each, all from Darla's catalog. The parlor was set up with folding chairs borrowed from the church, 40 seats. They filled every one, and a dozen more people stood along the walls and in the foyer. Judson's grandmother sat in the front row in a folding chair with her oxygen tank beside her. Corinne sat next to her, the plumber from the church was there, and the electrician and the neighbor who had left tomatoes on the porch their first week, and the women from the garden club, and the retired carpenter who had shown up with salvaged trim molding and never asked for anything in return. Dalton Langford sat in the second row in a clean flannel shirt, which was the closest thing he had to formal wear. Willa Torrance sat in the middle of the room with her 9-year-old niece beside her. Harlan Holbrook sat in the last row, his back against the wall, his posture as straight as it had been the first morning he showed up on Gideon's porch to tell him he was going to fail. The librarian came with a framed copy of the 1954 newspaper clipping. "Local girl 17 wins first place at state piano competition." She presented it to Margot before the recital started. The students played one by one. The 9-year-old boy went first, a simple piece called Morning Walk. He played it slowly and steadily, with both hands flat and careful, the way a child plays when he is concentrating so hard that the rest of the world disappears. The retired farmer played a piece called What the Hands Remember. His thick, stiff fingers found every note, and when he finished, he looked at his own hands on the keys as if he were seeing them for the first time. Odette Wyndham played For Hands That Remember, the same piece Margot had sight read the day they opened the sealed room. Odette played it clean and strong and without hesitation. Her scarred fingers moved across the keys with a confidence that had nothing to do with perfection and everything to do with refusal. refusal to accept what she had been told about herself, refusal to believe that damage was the same thing as limitation. When she finished, the room was quiet, not polite quiet, real quiet. The kind of quiet that means something has shifted in the air and everyone in the room knows it. Margot played last. She played Letter to Someone I Haven't Met, the most complex composition in the collection, written in Darla's final months. A piece that required real musicianship and emotional depth and the exact kind of adapted hand positions that made it possible for a woman with swollen joints and stiff fingers to play it. Margot had been working on it for weeks, and she played it now from memory with her eyes closed. Her left hand moved across the lower register, where Darla had rearranged every voicing so that the thumb and index finger carried the work that the ring finger could no longer do. Her right hand shaped the melody in the upper register with a gentleness that was not weakness, but restraint, the restraint of someone who has learned that the most powerful thing music can do is hold back just enough to leave room for the listener to feel something of their own. When she finished, nobody clapped right away. The last note hung in the room and dissolved into silence, and the silence held. Then Corinne started clapping, and the room followed, and the sound traveled up through the staircase to the third floor, where the door to Darla's room stood open, and the afternoon light came through the clean windows and fell across the Steinway's ebony case. After the recital, people stayed. They ate pie that Corinne had baked and drank coffee from the big percolator the church had loaned them. They walked through the house and looked at the photographs on the walls. Jolene and Darla, the Victorian in its original glory with flower boxes in every window. And they read Jolene's letter framed and hanging in the waiting room that had been one of the servants' quarters on the third floor. Harlan Holbrook stood in front of the framed letter for a long time. He read it twice. Gideon came and stood beside him. They stood together in the small room, two men in their 70s who had come to the street by different roads and found themselves standing in the same place. She wrote survived by no one, Harlan said. He was still looking at the letter. Gideon didn't respond. He waited. She was wrong, Harlan said. Look around this room. Look at those people downstairs. She survived by every single one of them. She just didn't know it yet. Gideon looked at the letter. He thought about Jolene alone in this house, sealing the door to her daughter's room and living in silence for years. She had believed she was the last of her line, that everything she loved would disappear with her. She had been wrong about that, and being wrong about it was the most beautiful thing Gideon had ever seen. They went downstairs. The parlor was still full. Someone had started playing the upright piano in the teaching studio. One of the students, a young girl, maybe 12, practicing scales. She wasn't performing for anyone. She was playing because she didn't want to stop. Gideon walked out to the front porch with a cup of coffee. A boy of about 12 came out the front door behind him and ran down the steps. He stopped on the sidewalk and looked up at the house at the tower at the third floor windows where the curtains moved in the breeze. My mom says this used to be the haunted house, the boy said. Gideon looked at the windows. He could hear Margot inside talking to someone, her voice warm and easy. He could hear the low murmur of people in the parlor and the clink of coffee cups. He could hear the girl on the upright piano still playing, still not wanting to stop. And underneath all of it, in the spaces between the sounds, the house itself, not creaking, not settling, just standing the way it had stood for more than 100 years, solid and patient and full. It's not haunted, Gideon said. It was just waiting. The boy shrugged and ran off down the sidewalk to find his mother. Gideon sat on the porch step, the same step where he'd sat the morning Corinne brought the muffins, the same step where he'd sat the evening Mercer drove away. The porch was solid under him, every board tight, every joint true. He could feel it through the wood, the steadiness of a thing that had been broken and put back together by people who cared about getting it right. The music started again. Margot had gone back upstairs. The third-floor windows were open, and Darla's music came through them and drifted out over the street the way Corinne said it used to when Darla was alive. And the windows were open on summer evenings, and people would stop on the sidewalk and stand there and listen. Down on the sidewalk, Judson was walking home from the hardware store with a bag of finishing nails in one hand. He heard the music and stopped. He didn't move. He stood on the cracked concrete with the late afternoon light coming through the elm trees and listened to the piano coming from the third floor of a house that he had helped rebuild from a condemned shell into something that people drove across the county to see. He stood there for maybe a minute, then he shifted the bag of nails to his other hand and kept walking, and the music followed him down the street the way the evening light followed him, touching everything and holding nothing, and making the ordinary world for a few minutes at least something worth standing still for. It was just a house, a real house with good bones and an open door and music coming through the windows. And the music had never stopped. It had just been waiting for the right hands to find it.